the beginning of the 19th century in Britain, it was the beginning of our railways. To build a railway required an Act of Parliament. The rich Victorian businessmen knew there was money to be made in railways. They changed more or less overnight to railway moguls, tycoons, railway pioneers. They knew there was vast amount of money to be made in railways. And then we had a railway mania. By 1846, there was no fewer than 272 Acts of Parliament to build railways. Railway shares increased day by day and month by month. To move large amount of freight through the country was the job of the canals, and even canals could only move a limited amount. Railways began as wagons being drawn by horse or roped pulled by a stationary steam engine. Coal mines and collieries had used rails to move wagons within their yards. So when locomotives could move freight a distance, it was realized there was money to be made, and the railway pioneer evolved. The railways were changing the country. What we'd never predicted was how much the Victorian public would love their railways. The stories of these famous railway engineers who built stations, bridges, tunnels, tracks over some of the most difficult terrain in Britain have been immortalised in our history. These famous men who built our railways have been well documented in books, in films, even in statues. But this is a film and a story about the people who, currently in the 21st century, you will know, but not in the 19th century. Railway policemen. Welcome to the history of the British Transport Police. The first mention of railway police has been connected to the Stockton to Darlington Railway, which opened on the 27th of September 1825. It refers to a police establishment of one superintendent, 4 officers, and a number of gatekeepers. In the early days of railway policemen, they did wear a uniform similar to a constable, a top hat and a tailored jacket with tails, or a frocked coat. The railway police controlled trains and not the law. They controlled hand signals by using flags, also controlling points, level crossings, and were responsible for the safe passage of trains. They carried watches, lamps, keys, flags, and a part of their duties were to prevent railway accidents. In the very early history of our railways, a railway policeman would walk in front of a train with a red flag warning people a train was approaching. But as trains got faster, the policeman would then stand at the line side, displaying a flag to proceed and a red flag to stop. Trains travelling between stations were worked by a system called time interval working. If it took a train 10 minutes to travel from one station to the next station, the following train would have to wait 10 minutes at the red flag before proceeding to the next station. But this became a major problem. In today's railway, it sounds quite bizarre, but time interval working was working in the railway for years. But at the time, there was a problem. What would happen if a train broke down and the following train proceeded? And this happened, causing collision, causing accidents, and causing death. Eventually, the flag was replaced by semaphore signals, which was taken from shipping. Plus, a new invention was introduced, the railway telegraph, which gave communication between each station. And the use of the telephone and a type of Morse code. plus standardisation of time. The whole of Britain was now at the same time using the 24-hour clock. Some railway policemen, despite being employed by their company, were also sworn in as special constables. This was a 1938 Review Act. In 1829, an Act of Parliament, agreed by the then Home Secretary, Sir Robert Peel, introduced the Metropolitan Police. His policemen were nicknamed Bobbies, or Peelers. And it's not that long ago that some train drivers referred to signalmen, particularly in England, as Bobbies. It seems public perception that the first police force in Britain was that of the Metropolitan Police, set up by Robert Peel in 1829. The railway police are mentioned 3 years earlier in 1826, although with no powers of law. But we need to travel to Scotland, to Glasgow, to find out who was the true first police force in Britain. I travelled to the City of Glasgow Police Museum in Bell Street in Glasgow and spoke to a retired police officer and curator of the museum and asked him about Patrick Colquhoun.
Patrick Colquhoun was born in 1745 in Dumbarton and went to America as a teenager. He came back 5 years later as a 21-year-old and he was a tobacco lord, a very rich man. He bought a piece of land on the west side of Glasgow and called it Kelvin Grove, and that's Kelvin Grove Park that we know today. He was Lord Provost twice of the city. He founded Britain's first Chamber of Commerce in Glasgow. He went to London in 1789 and he became a magistrate in the area surrounding London. He took an interest in people who were making coinage, forging or counterfeiting coins, and also helping people to get back to work rather than go to a life of crime, and helping the poor. And so he saw his job not just as being a strict magistrate, but also to try and get the causes of crime.
So did the police start in Glasgow?
We had known, and it's been well documented for well over 150 years, that the Glasgow Police had been the first in Britain, but there wasn't a lot of research have been done to prove it. We have the earliest Police Act in the United Kingdom, and it was signed by King George III on the 30th of June 1800. Now, I personally contacted the House of Lords Library, who store all the Acts of Parliament, going right back to medieval times, and they were able to confirm that that was the first Police Act for the UK. Well, it all goes back to 1788, when 6 magistrates in Glasgow had a committee in council, as they called it, for the setting up of a police force, and they wrote 17 pages of minutes that showed how the force should be set up, what uniform they should wear, what their duties would be, etc. And all that was put together. Now, the provisions of that was printed and given to all the magistrates, and one of these magistrates was Patrick Colquhoun. Just prior to him leaving for London, he suggested in a book called A Treatise on the Police of the Metropolis, he suggested that a preventative police force should be set up in London, and he used the minutes from Glasgow as the nucleus of that chapter in his book. So it was because he knew the reasons were perhaps different in London for setting up a police force, but he used the Glasgow concept that he took with him, and he is the link man who took the Glasgow idea to London, and it later was accepted down there, much later, because it would be another 30 years before Peel managed to get the Act of Parliament that set up the Metropolitan Police. No, it is really an urban myth that was perpetuated by history books being perhaps published in London and used in all throughout Britain, including Scotland, that said that he had formed the first person to invent the police. And it's really been a London-centric situation where, and it highlights the fact that if you write things in a book, people will believe them. The main thing is to have them backed up and references. And Peel has got this reputation because he made a success of setting up the Metropolitan Police, but it certainly wasn't the first police in Britain. Glasgow, as I say, was the first, but there was another 10 Scottish police forces set up with police acts of Parliament before the 1829 when the Metropolitan was set up. So the story really went from Scotland down to England rather than what the old history books would have us believe, that the idea started in London and spread to the rest of the country.
There are many historians believe that Patrick Colquhoun should have received a knighthood. He helped the poor, the starving with soup kitchens. He received the freedom of Edinburgh, yet there is no statue in Edinburgh, Glasgow or London. There is a statue of Robert Peel in Glasgow's George Square, and there are some people who are in the know. Ask why. Since filming at the City of Glasgow Police Museum, I've been informed that there may be serious problems with the future of this wonderful museum. It took Alistair and his team of volunteers years to set up this wonderful exhibit of police history. They may have to move out, put their exhibits into storage due to funding at their location, and this cannot be allowed to happen. The navvies, short for navigator, who built Britain's canals, were now building Britain's railways. Their families lived in temporary accommodation as they moved through the country. Lots of the navvies who came to Britain to build our railways were Irish, and some railway companies paid their navvies on a daily basis, and some of them spent the money on drink. This caused major problems for the railway companies. Navvies even started drunken fights with locals. The railway companies had to do something about it. So what they decided to do was give more of the railway policemen the power of arrest and made them constables. With some of the railway policemen now with the power of the law, constables, they continued to control movements of trains. Some of them carried truncheons engraved with the railway company's insignia and crest. So now, apart from controlling the movements of trains, our railway policemen were in charge in keeping law and order in the area of line under their control. The navvies building our railways had a hard life, and the railway policemen, with the powers of the law and still controlling the movements of trains, had to keep the peace with the locals and the Irish navvies building our railways. In 1839, when the Chester to Birkenhead Railway was nearly completed, there was a riot at Houghton between the English and the Irish navvies. The railway police were involved, but also the military arrived from Liverpool and Chester, and there was 28 arrests. In 1840, a supervisor was murdered by a navvy during the building of the Glasgow to Edinburgh Railway at Bishopbriggs. The responsible navvy was found guilty, and there was a public hanging on a bridge near Bishopbriggs. As the technology in the railways continued to improve, there was a changing role for our railway policemen. The railway signalling telegraph improved, and the introduction of the signalman. The railway policemen were more involved in preventing and investigating crime on our railways. Crime was on the increase. Criminals could move from town to town and city to city. As our friend Alistair from the City of Glasgow Police Museum had said earlier, that history can be twisted. You write it down and people will believe it. But how's this for an idea? As more and more stations opened up across our railways, and these stations contained a railway policeman, some think that's where the word police station comes from. But there was police before the railways. I'll leave it at that. The Liverpool to Manchester Railway introduced a railway train ticket. The local police officer issued these tickets 24 hours before travel. Passengers were required to give their name, age and reason for travel. He then noted it in his notebook, issued a ticket. Is that where the term booking office comes from? In 1845, a railway police sergeant was the first officer to arrest a murderer following the use of the electric telegraph. Shortly after the introduction of the Royal Mail to the railways, there was a problem: theft. By 1850, the top 6 railway companies were reporting losing money as much as £100,000 a year in theft. As crime increased on our railways, so did the want for compensation. So the London North Western Railway and the Great Western Railway formed the CID in 1863. Plainclothes officers had been used for years before, but now these new officers would carry tipstaffs, a small baton type normally made of brass, which had the company's crown or crest on its tip. The tipstaff was also used by plainclothes officers in the civil police, and this was a part of identification to prove to the public you were a policeman. By 1900, railway companies reorganised their police force. Uniforms were improved, as was pay and conditions, and by 1908, the railway police were the first to introduce police dogs at Hull docks. By 1914, the Great Eastern Railway employed 9 police women as special constables, the first police force to do so. During the First World War, the railways were essential for the war effort, but the railway police lost more than half its workforce to go to war. In 1919, after the First World War, the railway police were standardised and the Railway Police Federation was formed. In 1921, there was another great Railway Act for the amalgamation of the railways into the Big Four: the Great Western, the LMS, the London North Eastern Railway and the Southern Railway. Each had its own police force, controlled by a chief of police. During the Second World War years, the railway was run by the Railway Executive Committee, which set up a police committee. The committee coordinated British railway police and reported to the railway executive. By the end of the Second World War, it is well documented in history that our railways were in a mess. And in 1947, the Transport Act created the British Transport Commission, which eventually would unify our railways. In January 1949, the British Transport Commission Police was created, formed from the 4 old railway companies, Canal Police plus several dog forces. This now had an establishment of nearly 4,000 officers. The British Transport Commission Police were now the second largest police force in Britain. The Railway Police was such a large organisation now that at the end of the Second World War and by 1948, the Railway Police opened a training centre, a training college. It opened at Cadworth. In 1957, an arbitrator granted the Railway Police the same rate of pay as the Civil Police. But as the Railway Police force was the second largest force in the country, there was a question: do we need a separate police force for our railways? The British Transport Commission set up an inquiry into this very question. The Maxwell-Johnson inquiry found that the police requirement for the railways could not be met by a civil police force, and it was essential that the specialised police force was retained. The railway policeman has had a long journey from the days of controlling the movements of trains, but over its history, politicians and inquiries have looked at the need for a separate police force for our railways. The Transport Police in London nearly merged with the Metropolitan Police in 2006. But with some civil police forces amalgamating, could the future be the end of the line for the railway constable? History so far has said no, as our railways require the professional force that is the British Transport Police.